Now, welcome back to part 2 of a 3-part presentation that is looking at the implications of the Chinese cruise that circumnavigated Australia in early 2025. It will look at how the cruise represents a crisis for the RAAF. Strangely enough, based on information coming out of America, it is the F-35 that is the issue. Part 2 also looks at whether the RAAF has created an absolute, a flaw so profound that it brings into question Australia's entire strategic policy. In this series of presentations on the Chinese cruise, as well as earlier presentations, I noted the immense geographic scale that made planning for the defence of Australia so difficult. The really complicating factor is a current focus on defending the north, or more accurately, the northwest. Yet, this region is almost empty of infrastructure and people, while the southeast has the overwhelming bulk of both. I will emphasise that I am not saying we should abandon the north in some modern form of the Brisbane line. Far from it. At this time, I am simply pointing out the concentration of sites that are, for our military, risks that must be mitigated. This map shows the location of potential targets within the southeastern demographic and industrial heart of Australia. It does exclude sites of political or logistical importance. They are the military bases of Amberley, Williamtown, the HQ for the JOC, Edinburgh and Sydney. There is the military production facilities of the Redback in Geelong, Victoria, and the Boxer in Redbank, Queensland. There are the munitions facilities, including the missile assembly line in Newcastle, New South Wales, something, perhaps, one day at Benalla in Victoria, the precision-guided munition assembly line also in Sydney, New South Wales, and of course we have the naval production facilities of AUKUS and the Hunter frigates over in Adelaide. I'll now include the launch radius for Chinese submarines using cruise missiles with a 1,000 kilometre range from 3 locations. As you can see, the potential for multiple launch locations and flight paths makes it very difficult to protect these sites. Also, don't be fooled by the scale of the map. There's 3,000 kilometres between the launch point of South Australia and that for southern Queensland. Notably, just like America, the range of these Chinese missiles is increasing dramatically. This is the combined list. Now I'll overlay the effective range of the F-35s based out of Amberley and Williamtown, using information I presented in earlier presentations. The first ring is the range of the F-35s in a contested airspace. Note that, for this example, the location of the Chinese attackers is almost irrelevant. It is the ability to intercept the missiles they launch that I am focusing on. Importantly, very importantly, as it turns out, there is not going to be a contested airspace this far south without Chinese aircraft carriers. It is my belief that it's pretty clear that they are unavailable for operations this far south for perhaps at least a decade, if not longer. This obviously means the F-35s will have an extended operational range without in-flight refueling. This second ring is the 1,500 kilometre mark for the F-35s using tankers for in-flight refueling. While ranges can be longer for strike missions, it actually becomes far more complicated and therefore range restricted for providing a permanent air presence at a distance. At face value, it looks pretty good, but it is the maximum range for providing permanent air cover of just 2 F-35s within the circle. In a previous presentation, I showed that this permanent cover of just 2 planes would require the complete commitment of an entire squadron of F-35s, plus a significant percentage of our tankers and wedgetails. What this means is that planes out of Williamtown would provide cover for only parts of the area within the circle at any one time, and would be reliant upon sensors giving them enough warning to intercept any launched missiles. What is absolutely fascinating is the concentration of some incredibly important sites in South Australia. They are all at the extreme end of the range of fighters based out of Williamtown, even using in-flight refueling. Again, without permanent air cover, geographic scale kicks in. If we had fully armed F-35s in the air near Williamtown, and depending on when the submarine launched cruise missiles were detected, then our fighters just, and I mean just, might get there in time to intercept some of the inbound missiles. At risk are not just the AUKUS production facilities and the RAAF base. It is also the home to the Army's only long-range strike brigade. I discussed the vulnerability of Townsville in Part 1, but in terms of neutralising a country's defence capabilities, there are few sites in the world that offer such value as Edinburgh and Osborne, and at such an extraordinary low risk to the attacker. It is completely bizarre that not only has the Army been gutted, but that its only two major formations, 3rd Brigade in Townsville and 10th Brigade in Adelaide, are, once again due to continental scale, almost devoid of protection by the RAAF. Again, none of this mattered as long as the Chinese could not threaten these sites. And then the crews proved they could. If you use the area the fighters can cover as limited to the maximum range of the Wedge-Tails radar, which is about 600 kilometres, you get a much smaller circle of coverage. This is a critical weakness. While the Wedge-Tails radar coverage can be supplemented by the Poseidons and the F-35s themselves, both have significantly less range than the Wedge-Tails. Once more, we have to identify cruise missiles as far out to sea as possible in order to guarantee interception. This means either permanent coverage of the southeast by at least 3 Wedge-Tails, or accept the risk of no coverage of sites, even if temporarily, as less aircraft conduct extended patrol routes. As we only have 6 Wedge-Tails, with some always down for maintenance, then in the face of Chinese aggression, coverage of the maritime threats to Australia's demographic heartland will almost certainly be sporadic. This means that we will never have enough Wedge-Tails and tankers if they are also required in the north. You can start to see some of the compounding problems identified by the Chinese crews. Insufficient ground-based radar coverage in the southeast, insufficient Wedge-Tails to operate on 2 sides of a continent, diverting Poseidons to extended patrols in the southeast, and of course pressure on the fighters. The total lack of subsurface sensors that our strategic partners heavily rely upon in the East and South China Seas, as I discussed in Part 1, is of course a serious issue. Equally, it is one that could be corrected if defence was open about the need and the cost. You can see the obvious problem with this display is what is simply not discussed, which is a pivot to the north in response to a Chinese task force operating in blue water. And perhaps they're operating in and out of Indonesian territory using the right of innocent passage. There is absolutely no reason to believe that China would ever follow a single threat model once they develop the logistical capacity to maintain a substantial number of ships at sea. The inevitable result was the ability to send 2 task forces, one to the northwest operating in and out of Indonesian territory, and another to the southeast, following the same route as a cruise. Conversely, the ADF, in its current structure, simply can't respond to 2 simultaneous threats separated by a continent, and this includes the RAAF. The extraordinary strike capabilities of the new Chinese submarines, based around their own vertical launch systems, seriously complicates air defence options. Just ask the Iranians, who failed to intercept a single Tomahawk from the 30 that were launched in 2025 against a variety of targets defending or supporting Iranian nuclear production facilities. This is despite the Tomahawks flying over Iran through regions covered by a variety of civilian or military radar installations. There is a complacency in Australia along the lines that were not the Iranians, or the Russians, or the Chinese. It kind of reminds me of the mindset in 1941, just before the Japanese cut loose. After all, in this example here, the Iranians were only using Russian air defense systems or reversed engineered domestic systems. The problem is that even the Iranian systems are a hell of a lot better than ours, because ours simply don't exist. And when we do get them, they will be in limited numbers and in limited locations that are determined by the DSR. Air defence is Australia's greatest weakness. Not only is the Australian strategic heartland extremely vulnerable to Chinese sub-launched cruise missiles, so too are the ADF sites and operations in the north. The crews showed that the limited number of long-range air defence missiles we are getting are nowhere near enough. geographical distance means each potential target requires separate batteries, as the distance between them are too great for mutual support. This means we need relatively isolated air defence systems at multiple sites across Australia, and we are not even getting close to what the DSR says is needed. At sea, although the Royal Australian Navy is obtaining long-range air defence missiles for the Hobarts, the Anzac frigates remain seriously outdated. A task group based around the Hobart would, in terms of offensive firepower and long-range air defence, be seriously disadvantaged. In fact, completely outclassed by the Chinese Task Force that circumnavigated Australia. That only leaves our 4 squadrons of fighters to provide air defence, not only for any Royal Australian naval operation, but also for the defence of Australia's strategic heartland, as well as the defence of Tyndall, as well as the defence of any base used for forward deployment. And of course, then there is the pressure on the support aircraft. Should, in the event of a multi-threat scenario, the ADF still pivot north as per its current philosophy, then its 12 to 14 Poseidons, 6 Wedgetails and 7 tankers would need to provide radar coverage, ASW operations and air-to-air refuelling in 2 areas separated by a continent. Complicating these numbers are availability rates. To the Australian public, it is one of the great unknowns, though the Chinese would know using fairly simple spycraft. The more complex an aircraft, especially its systems, the lower the availability rate. As a result, you would expect availability rates to be highest for the tankers and somewhat lower for the Poseidons. However, the systems on the Wedgetails, both the most expensive and scarcest of our support aircraft, are quite complex, even though the airframe itself is very robust. The Wedgetail is a superb aircraft, and the RAAF appears to do a great job of keeping it in the air. However, the average age of our Wedgetails is 15 years, and that is important. Under sustained operations in areas separated by a continent, availability rates will quickly collapse. Historical evidence for similar aircraft would suggest that in those circumstances, availability rates for the Wedgetails would inevitably drop to 50% or lower, which means 2 or 3 aircraft across the continent. And then there are our fighters, and it's time, with apologies, for another one of my detours. The following discussion on the F-35 cannot be specific for Australia because, unlike America, our Defence Department does its usual trick of hiding details from Australians. Therefore, almost all of the following is based on data from America, especially reports to the US Congress and its audit offices, and they are all publicly available. I've included links in the description and they are worth a look. Before I go on, I would like to point out that I am in fact a supporter of the F-35. When I published my book in 2023 and completed the presentation on defence acquisitions, I even championed the planned replacement of the Super Hornets by the F-35. The cruise in the American data has highlighted some serious issues that requires a rethink, not just by myself, but also by the defence establishment. The F-35 is an incredibly powerful bird. It is, however, also highly complex and fragile. As in all air campaigns from the Great War to the skies over Afghanistan, the complexity and fragility of the aircraft used determines how many are available for operations. After the plane design reaches maturity, and based on real-life experience, that availability becomes simple math. As an example, once bedded down, availability rates for the venerable F-15E stayed at roughly 70% for nearly 20 years. Conversely, the F-4, the US Air Force's mainstay during the Vietnam War, saw operational availability rates fall well below 50%. In comparison to the complexity of the F-15E, the F-4 was America's attempt to prove that if you put a big enough engine on it, you could fly a rock. But a flying rock did not make a good fighter under war-like conditions, which is to say that availability rates in peacetime are significantly greater than what is possible under operational conditions. Back to the F-35. It is now a mature design aged to the same point as when the availability rate for the F-15 stabilised. It's not a good result. The F-35's availability rate has failed to reach its target by an abysmal margin because it is far more fragile than predicted. Overall, in US squadrons, it has an availability rate of 53%, only increasing to 61% in combat-coded aircraft, and most of these squadrons equipped with these planes are not operating under warlike conditions. In other words, it's not doing much better in peacetime conditions than the F-4 was achieving flying combat missions over Vietnam. Note that squadrons requiring combat-coded F-35s have the newest aircraft, but they still failed to reach their revised target of 65%. In fact, this revised target was already dramatically reduced from the original 80% promised in the brochure. It's becoming pretty clear that the flow of new aircraft is vital to the Americans maintaining the availability rates for the F-35. New aircraft deliveries were, as a percentage, much higher over the last few years, and even last year, brand new aircraft made up about 10% of the fleet. The data out of America shows that the constant flow of new aircraft is masking the failure of the F-35's maintenance network. As the RAAF has received all its F-35s, this masking effect is no longer available for Australia. There are also differences between the three variants. The F-35A's total fleet availability rate is actually lower than the combined fleet, and the F-35A's availability rate stands at about 45%. This very low availability rate for the RAAF variant appears to be age-based. The US Navy's F-35Cs are younger planes, but also the nature of support based around naval personnel on fully equipped supercarriers seems to play a role. And this is an important point when considering deploying the RAAF's planes forward. I'll be discussing all these points in more detail a little later. In terms of availability, the Yanks apply the following classifications to the F-35. The highest classification is fully mission capable. I'll just use FMC from now on. Less than half of all combat-coded F-35s in the US fleet were FMC. Of the three variants, the carrier or C variant has a higher availability rate. The RAAF, of course, has the A variant. I found it fascinating that the C variant had the best availability rate given it operates generally from aircraft carriers in a highly corrosive environment. The second classification is mission capable. 13% of all combat-coded F-35s in the US fleet were in this lower state of readiness. It is applied when one or more systems are offline. A congressional research paper gave the example of an F-35 with its night fighting systems offline as still being mission capable. This means, obviously, that an F-35 can be substantially less effective but still considered mission capable. Not available has an obvious meaning. What is interesting here is a subset of F-35s that are unavailable due to a lack of spare parts. About 1 in 10 F-35s were unavailable because of insufficient spares. The critical failure rate is quite fascinating, and I'll be talking more about this later with regards to the RAAF. This makes for some interesting numbers for Australia using those American rates for 72 aircraft. So we'd be looking at a FMC rate of 35 aircraft, mission capable rate of about another 10 aircraft, about 20 aircraft would be unavailable, and the 7 would actually be grounded due to a lack of spare parts. However, America also has precedence over spare parts. It is probable, in fact quite likely, that the number of RAAF F-35s that are grounded waiting on spare parts is on average higher than the Yanks. Now bear in mind, out of the recent conflagration in the Middle East, the RAAF has said that it has no control over the replacement parts for the F-35, that they are basically owned by the Americans, and that it is the Americans who are transferring them from Australia to Israel. That makes it a rather interesting scenario when you think about it. It means that even with the spare parts in Australia, we don't maintain control of them. It's quite extraordinary. Now, what is deeply disturbing is that Australia actually has a high percentage of aircraft that are considered old by F-35 standards, and that's quite an extraordinary statement. One of the more interesting aspects of F-35 availability is how quickly it drops by age. There is quite a remarkable drop-off in availability at the 4-year mark, and that's partly from needed upgrades, partly from a lack of spare parts, and partly from much lower resilience to wear and tear. The Americans acknowledge the availability issues, but there is no specific data I could find on the ratio between the three categories. But as I'll discuss, it seems to be primarily due to age. What is fascinating is that the FMC rate drops far more rapidly than the average availability rate. Initially, the bulk of the available F-35s are FMC, and as a percentage, it starts off at around 80%. Yet, by age 7, just age 7, FMC make up barely half of the available aircraft. This table applies the rates America has achieved to the RAAF, and you can see how important the age of the aircraft is on the availability rate. But I would emphasize for those aircraft we got in 2018, you can look at in the United States, they would expect an average FMC rate for these aircraft of barely 1 in 5. It's quite extraordinary. Now, as I've said, in terms of both availability and FMC rates, the 4-year mark is an astonishing cutoff point. One of the reasons is the dreadful implementation of the software and equipment upgrades known as Technology Refresh 3 and Block 4. However, while the F-35 will not deliver all that was promised on the brochure without these upgrades, it still remains an impressive aircraft. But the upgrades are needed. There have been American F-35s that have sat in a depot for over a year as a result of wear and tear and these upgrades. Australia has started implementing the same upgrades, but once again, we are at the bottom of the supply chain. Still, availability rates for America's F-35s were declining by year at a rapid rate even before the upgrades, so the impact of these upgrades appears overstated in overall availability rates. So we come back to the fact that the age of the F-35 seems to be the most important factor in availability, which means the relative age of the Australian F-35 fleet compared to the American average means our availability rates are probably on the lower end of the scale. The RAAF's entire fleet will be over 4 years of age by 2028, and its aircraft will then be at the lowest rates for availability. In 2028, based on the age impact upon F-35s that has been documented by the Americans, we will be looking at an overall availability rate of just over 40% and a full mission capable rate of just over 20%. Despite its significant reserves, from 2028 in sustained operations, these figures show that the RAAF would be lucky to have the equivalent of a single squadron of F-35s that are FMC and another whose planes who have one or more systems offline, and well over half effectively grounded. Now, let me say right off that this undoubtedly overstates how many of our F-35s are unavailable. The number of planes held in reserves by the RAAF provides it with flexibility. In periods of high intensity, such as training exercises, it increases the amount of flying hours actual by allowing the number of F-35s in the depot to increase. Subsequently, it then takes pressure off the depot by reducing the amount of flying hours actual. Without details, hint hint to any senator watching, we don't know how much the Australian F-35 fleet is being flown, but it is probably lower than was originally expected, just to take the pressure off maintenance and to reduce the impact of aging. However, we know the Americans are also dramatically reducing the average hours flown by the F-35 compared to other fighter aircraft. The only way the RAAF can better American availability rates, therefore, is by further reducing and quite dramatically reducing the number of flying hours for each F-35. This, of course, raises a whole different set of problems. If the RAAF does not dramatically reduce flying hours, then the very low availability rates for the F-35s over 4 years of age remain applicable. If forced to fly aircraft at a sustained operational tempo, which, after all, is why we have them, then the availability rates for the F-35 will quickly decline. Maths is maths. The RAAF is incredibly good at managing the availability of its aircraft. It is, in fact, one of the best in the world. But there are limits, and in this case, the biggest limit is clearly the plane itself. Now it's time to look at the impact of the F-35's fragility in any pivot to the north, that is in response to any Chinese threat. Once again, after all, this is a primary role of the RAAF in the classic threat model that underpins the DSR. And once again, the data coming out of America is not good. Even ignoring the effects of age on availability, the major problem for the RAAF in any pivot to the north is the F-35's appalling critical failure rate. A critical failure is one that renders the plane unsafe to fly or complete a mission. The plane started off with an average of once every 20 hours. It started off with a target of an average of once every 20 hours. This doesn't mean that an F-35 would fly for 20 hours and immediately end up in a depot. Some will fly for 100 hours without a problem. Some will be barely able to get off the tarmac before it's back in the shop. It's an average. When introduced, the entire US F-35 fleet barely achieved half the target critical failure rate, but it was expected to reach the 20-hour target once all the problems were bedded down. We now know the math thanks to the Americans, but they are far from what we hoped. The critical rate for the RAAF's F-35A variant has remained a shockingly low average of 1 every 10.5 hours of flying time. Now, every fighter has a critical failure rate, but it is especially problematic for the F-35 due to how its maintenance is organised. A critical failure may result in the F-35 being returned to a depot, while an unknown percentage can be repaired at the airfield. The deciding factor for the percentage that is repairable at the airfield is obviously reliant upon the resources available, whether it be trained technicians, complex maintenance equipment, or even the ability to safely store the needed spare parts. In any pivot to the north, this becomes a significant weakness for the RAAF, but one whose actual impact is kept remarkably hidden. Before I go on, there's a couple of interesting statistics here. You'll note that the carrier variant saw a remarkable drop or worsening in the critical failure rate within a year. This suggests that, like the earliest adoption of the other variants, the US Navy is running into the same 4-year crisis. Note also the relatively small increase in the cumulative hours for the RAAF-A variant, despite the fleet growing each year. This is borne out in the congressional documents, which shows the average number of flying hours for the A variant to continue to decline. In fact, the US Air Force flying hours target was never achieved and had to be substantially reduced. In other words, the Yanks are only achieving these low availability rates by keeping planes on the ground. A quick note on the F-35B variant that is sometimes recommended for our Canberra-class Elephants. The United States Marine Corps has achieved comparatively good critical failure rates for this variant. However, they only achieved it by a sleight of hand, thus simply not flying them. Keeping them on the ground provides maintenance crews with the extra time to identify problems before they become serious. This chart shows the average flying hours per aircraft. The old Harrier, even at nearly 3 decades, could be flown for longer hours. Despite this mothering of their F-35Bs, the FMC rates for the B variant are shockingly low at less than 10%. Equally, if you keep your flying hours so low, then at some point, no matter how impressive the F-35B are if you get them in the air, you actually have nothing more than a rather expensive sun shield for the ship. At current availability rates, we would need a full squadron of F-35B variants to keep just 2 at sea on a Canberra. Even so, on average, only one of them would be FMC. I'm pretty sure that operationally, the Marines, like the Royal Navy, despair at their adopting the F-35B. In other words, it would be a serious and costly mistake for Australia to adopt this variant. Is it all doom and gloom for the F-35? Now, I apologise for the length of this section, but it's rather important because there is actually an example of how Australia can keep enough F-35s in the air, and it comes from a rather strange place. It's an area of perpetual conflict, and it is, of course, the Israeli Air Force. The Israeli Air Force, in recent fighting, had availability rates far above what the Americans are achieving under peacetime conditions. Anecdotally, they have maintained availability rates of 80% with F-35s as old as Australia's. However, FMC rates are unclear. The question is, why? And the answer is actually quite involved, because unlike the Americans, the Israeli maintenance facilities, the depots, are co-located, or the depot, are co-located with the operational squadrons. Given the size of the country, all domestic members of the supply chain are, at worst, only hours away. The Israelis obtained limited manufacturing rights and the ability to modify the plane using their own technology. They have an advanced aeronautical industry that enables them to build quite significant F-35 components, such as wings. That same industry provides very capable software not reliant upon American industry. They have invested considerable amounts of money creating an oversupply of spare parts not locally produced. In other words, the Israeli F-35s were able to operate for some time without the need to rely upon the US supply chain. And this cannot be overstated. The personnel at the depots that maintain the F-35s do so under wartime conditions. Overwhelmingly, they are trained members of the Israeli Air Force and not contractors. Combined with the American figures, this suggests that being based with a depot increases availability by another 20 to 30 points. Sadly, if Israel is a model, then we have done everything we possibly can to make sure we don't achieve their results. In comparison to Israel, Australia is fully reliant upon American spare parts and electronic upgrades. There is simply no oversupply of spare parts anywhere near the scale achieved by Israel. In time, we still seem to rely upon just-in-time logistics support. We are reliant upon the same contractor-based maintenance system that bedevils Americans' depots, and, perhaps most importantly, in any pivot to the north, we are putting over 2,000 kilometres between the Williamtown depot and the deployed squadrons. However, to be fair, the geographic scale of Israel compared to Australia is quite small. It would fit into Tasmania 3 times, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the impact of geographic scale. Let's get back to what all this means for the RAAF's pivot to the north. The modular nature of the F-35 means that many critical failures are repairable at an airfield, while others will require the aircraft to be returned to a depot. It's a little unclear what the percentage is for aircraft that are returned to a depot, but anecdotally it's high enough for the Yanks to openly express concern. This really raises the questions for any forward deployment of the RAAF as to whether it is even possible to conduct anything but very minor maintenance or repairs at its bare bases. What did I mean by whether it's even possible? Just like the aircraft, maintenance for the F-35 is highly complex. So too is the amount of equipment it needs. The support equipment for the F-35 is so extensive that the American GAO reported that when a single USAF squadron was deployed overseas on short notice, a total of 13 Globemasters were required to just transport the support equipment and technicians. To put it into perspective, that is nearly double the total number of Globemasters in Australia. Even if we could transport this invaluable equipment, it would be arriving at a bare base with no infrastructure and, far more importantly, no air defence apart from the fighters themselves. Now at the moment, all major maintenance for the F-35 is done at the Williamtown depot in New South Wales. I doubt, and I am happy to be proved wrong, that no major support equipment would be transported to a bare base on the other side of Australia. This is simply because we don't have enough of it. The RAAF would have to duplicate the equipment it uses at Williamtown and then ensure it's air transportable. Also, not unimportantly, the majority of the engineers and technicians are private contractors working for BAE or other firms. Would they be risked in a combat zone? The clear answer is no. This means that only minor repairs and maintenance to our F-35s will be done on a forward airbase. Anything more serious will require the F-35 to be repaired at the Williamtown depot. Of course, this means getting it to the other side of a continent, under its own power if possible, or more likely by transport. This will lead to a constant flow of aircraft from the north of Australia to Williamtown and back again. Tyndall, with its established maintenance infrastructure, probably can repair more aircraft on site. However, the number that suffer a critical failure that have to be returned to Williamtown is kept secret from Australians. But we do know from the Americans that there is a constant flow from its squadrons to its depots. If our own data was made public, we would have a better idea of the risks associated with a pivot to the north. Of course, we don't. Still, in comparison to Tyndall, a bare base will obviously struggle to do much more than clean the canopy and fuel and arm an F-35. Therefore, the flow of aircraft between a bare base and Williamtown will be significantly higher. The first problem then, in fact the major problem, is repairing critical failures. Again, the F-35s are modular, but for simplicity's sake I'm going to refer to depot maintenance in terms of whole planes. The second problem for the RAAF is the capacity of the depot itself. Originally, the RAAF target for the maintenance contract would have enabled it to provide the number of flying hours it considered the minimum based on the expected availability rates. This is where the quality of Australia's Senate estimates is really quite poor, no matter what side of politics. In comparison to the American equivalent, our Parliamentary Oversight Committee is actually quite dreadful, so questions our senators should be asking are left unanswered. We don't know the number of F-35s the depot run by BAE Systems can be returned to service per day, or even if it is so low that it is measured in days per F-35. I will emphasise that the Chinese will know, in this case a Spycraft 101, that we saw done by the Japanese around Pearl Harbor. It would be really nice if the Australian public had access to that same information. What we do know is that the F-35 is falling far short of its availability targets, which means additional maintenance costs. Hopefully, when Defence Capability Acquisition Group signed the contract, they built some fat into it in case the target wasn't reached. However, based on their competency, the additional costs of having enough spare capacity and expectations for the F-35, I would bet there wasn't as much fat as was actually needed. Until the commencement of the F-35 modernisation program, their sustainment budget, in fact, stayed almost unchanged for 3 years, at a little over $6.5 million per plane. This obviously means there was no significant increase in maintenance facilities, despite the obvious problems of keeping the F-35 in the air. This means that, as in America, our F-35s are flying far less hours than were originally planned due to budget restraints and to reduce stress on the maintenance facilities. And again, we simply don't know exactly how bad it is. The infrastructure problems, both human and manufacturing, keep compounding. It takes a long time to get the engineers and technicians trained up to be competent enough to repair an F-35, or at least that's a level of training the pilots and I would certainly hope they reached. There would have been a delay in any increase in the workforce based on the expectations that the F-35 would eventually achieve its critical failure targets, but it looks like BAA is now finding innovative ways to develop its workforce. Equally, the equipment is very expensive, so you wouldn't invest in it until absolutely necessary. The last thing you would want is not having enough planes going through the depot that you end up with engineers and technicians sitting around doing nothing but cleaning idle equipment. Again, based on American experience, they are having serious trouble getting F-35s or repaired major components out of their depots. We don't have a realistic assessment of the numbers, just continual expressions of frustration and concern by both American technicians and Overwatch agencies. There is no reason to believe we would be doing any better than the Yanks. The final problem is that there is a shortage of critical parts for the F-35. The Americans are having trouble getting their own planes back into the air. Over a quarter of all unavailable F-35s are grounded due to a lack of spare parts, and some of them are grounded for what appears to be a long time. To a great extent, it appears their depot system is dysfunctional, and the Americans are unable to repair major components. They are actually resorting to buying brand new components and just leaving the older components unrepaired, and they're doing this just to keep planes in the air. Perhaps more importantly, the Americans are being forced to choose which theatre gets priority for new or repaired aircraft. That makes life interesting for the RAAF if it has to make the same choices. The shortage of spare parts in America must be impacting the RAAF, even if it is just by running down our own stock of critical components. While this may be a temporary crisis while the Yanks get their act together, it simply has not noticeably improved over the last decade, so it looks more like a permanent business as usual situation on the other side of the Pacific. As an aside, this does highlight, with the introduction of the F-35, a surprising lack of depth to American air power. We really should take note of it because it does change what we can expect from America in a crisis. Based on the actual availability rates compared to the brochure, the US is effectively down 100 aircraft in 2025. The United States Air Force is stretched simply because over 2 years there have been American aircraft actively engaged in combat missions in the Middle East and Persian Gulf. This is, however, the number of air squadrons involved are quite low compared to the total. These squadrons are getting the youngest F-35s and first call on repaired aircraft. Based on the number of aircraft flying more than 30 hours a month, they represent about 10% of America's F-35 squadrons. This means availability rates would be higher for those squadrons, lower for the rest. Again, I'll note the better availability rates for the carrier variant, and this performance reflects a far lower reliance upon contractors, which means that it is improved by the outstanding quality of the United States Navy personnel and the operational standards it expects. It is why, to this day, the United States Navy remains the most impressive naval force in the world, albeit hampered by a serious decline in mass during the century. Age of the F-35Cs is becoming an issue, but the way maintenance is performed differently between the US Air Force and the US Navy may be the major difference between the availability rates being lower for the A variants. Sadly, it's a great pity we went down the same contractor-based maintenance procedure as the US Air Force and not that of the service-based emphasis of the United States Navy. However, back to the RAAF, the simple matter is the maths don't change. Either you increase your repair capacity or reduce your flying hours, or you increase the number of aircraft in the depot, or you do a combination of all three. Politically, as long as the RAAF reports that all its F-35 squadrons are operational, even if all planes may not be FMC, the government of the day is content. In fact, there's some evidence that the government of the day hasn't even asked. If the number of aircraft in the depot slowly climbs, then that is a problem for future budgets, even future governments. As an example, if the number of F-35s becomes a constant 10 by the time of the next election, then the effective RAAF reserve is halved, and we would not have in place any additional maintenance capacity to increase to that needed for combat or combat-like operations. So what does this all mean? My personal belief is that, ignoring the Growlers and the Super Hornets, the RAAF will always go into any crisis with 3 squadrons of fully mission-capable F-35s. And they will do so because the RAAF, both as an organisation and because of the quality of its personnel, is really that good. Unfortunately, that's not the issue. Instead, the cruise has shown that its major weakness when responding to China's preferred threat models is the availability of its reserve planes and the depth of its maintenance structure. Equally, there remains concerns over the availability of the Super Hornets. They are doing better than the F-35s, but they are still not aging well, even with the upgrades. Availability rates out of the US is 42% at age 10. Australia's are much older at 15. And the Yanks are looking at an availability rate of under 25% for their Super Hornets at this age. However, RAAF Super Hornets are not subject to the level of corrosion seen on American carriers, so hopefully our availability rates should be much higher. How much higher are our rates, especially in sustained operations, is of course unknown. Again, the Chinese know, so it appears that the ADF and Defence Department leadership think that the real enemy is the Australian public. Okay, back to the cruise. What does this all mean? Once the cruise passed the Queensland-New South Wales border and started operating in the Tasman Sea, the cruise highlighted several surprising weaknesses in the RAAF. Maybe the Chinese knew and were just showing that they did, or maybe they just fluked it off. Still, I'm going to run a couple of scenarios stemming from this cruise. This is the basic infrastructure needs of the F-35s, given the RAAF's deployment under the DSR, which is, of course, the pivot to the north in response to any Chinese threat during a period of heightened tension. In this scenario, the Chinese are maintaining at sea a relatively large task force made up of between 6 and 8 surface ships, operating about 900 kilometres away from both their bases in the west. Combined, they have enough range and firepower to simultaneously devastate both air bases as well as any Australian naval force that may appear. Under the DSR, in response to this threat, both the Army and the Air Force deploy forward. There are 4 major components to the RAAF's pivot to the north. There are, of course, the deployed forces, which in this example will relocate to RAAF Curtin. There is RAAF Tyndall's role to protect itself and its vulnerable infrastructure from any sub-launched or long-range bomber-launched cruise missiles. Then there is the reserve component, which is remain based at Bamberley or Williamtown, and of course there is the aircraft kept in the Williamtown depot. Finally, there is the tankers, transport and wedge tails needed for the fighter aircraft to function effectively. In this pivot to the north scenario, the RAAF must obviously protect the bare bases. Again, back to maths. Simply for the RAAF to maintain a permanent combat air patrol of just 2 aircraft will lead to, on average, between 4 and 5 critical failures per day, and that's purely based on current F-35 availability statistics. Again, it's a bit more nuanced, and by good management this should be lower, at least initially, but no matter what you do, the critical failure rate doesn't change. Lower rates initially just mean higher critical failure rates later. It's a daily average, not an absolute. On available information, it is also impossible to know exactly how many are repairable at Curtin and how many will have to return to Williamstown, nor how many can be spared from Tyndall in the face of long-range Chinese air power or even the potential of submarine-launched land strike missiles. A complicating factor in this scenario is minor repairs and the loss of FMC. The deployed aircraft must be kept at a higher state of readiness and some prepared for immediate response. This creates wear and tear in its own right. We do now know that the F-35 loses FMC very quickly, though even the Americans are a little cagey about this. However, using the statistics available from America and Israel, we can have a pretty good guess. Still, what I can guarantee is that as the number of sorties increase, no matter how good are the ground crew, the F-35 maintenance facilities at any bare base will be overwhelmed. Graphically, this is what it represents. RAAF Curtin and Tyndall are the main priorities. The reserves feed spare aircraft to both sides. F-35s needing anything more than minor repairs are moved back to the depot at Williamtown. This depot will have to repair, on average, up to 4 or 5 aircraft per day. If it can't maintain this repair rate, then the number of spare aircraft in reserve will steadily decline. This is a table on how the depot's repair capability impacts upon the F-35. In a crisis, the depot may reach higher rates, but eventually fatigue and a lack of spare parts will bring it back down. Note that it is always far more nuanced than what I can cover in this presentation. The final number, the important number, is the number of days it will take for the RAAF to run out of F-35s held in reserve. It's incredibly fast. Note that this is a worst case scenario, but also remember that the number of aircraft in long-term maintenance, anywhere from 5 to 10 depending on what happens over the next few years, has already reduced the number of F-35s in reserve. Essentially, unless Williamtown can return to service about 3 aircraft per day that have suffered a critical failure, then the RAAF will exhaust its reserves within a week of having just to keep 2 aircraft in the air on a 24/7 basis. All this doesn't mean that the RAAF is going to cease within days, but it does give you an idea of how limited the flying hours are for its F-35s due to the aircraft's failure to get remotely close to its predicted availability targets. More importantly, you can see how the capacity of the Williamtown depot is crucial for sustained operations by the RAAF. Complicate this scenario with another, quite reasonable deployment. The Royal Australian Navy dispatches a covering task force containing 2 of the powerful Hobarts and a couple of Anzac frigates. I am ignoring the 1 Collins class submarine that could be in the area, as it has no impact on RAAF deployment. However, the Air Force now has to provide permanent air cover for this task force. The reason is that no matter how good the Hobarts are, the Chinese can launch missiles in enough mass to overwhelm their defences. The Royal Australian Navy Task Force needs fighter aircraft for its own protection. In the Gulf, American air power has, unsurprisingly, provided a highly flexible and very effective tool in shooting down anti-ship missiles. The question is whether the 2 F-35s on patrol could cover both the Royal Australian Navy Task Force and its own base at Curtin. The answer is probably not, and that's because of that ever-present enemy of the DSR, geographic scale. If it came to a shooting war, there is a real risk of a Chinese submarine lurking within strike range of RAAF Curtin. This makes life very interesting for the RAAF. If it needs to keep a minimum of 4 aircraft permanently in the air, then it's going to lose between 9 and 10 F-35s every single day due to critical failures. It gets quite frightening how quickly the RAAF burns through its reserves when it has to maintain permanent air cover of just 4 F-35s. Its reserves will not last a week, and that's even if the depot is repairing an average of 5 planes per day. Now the question is whether this threat scenario is reasonable. Under the DSR, there is an expectation that the approach of any Chinese task force that militarily threatens Australia will be part of an actual conflict. The reserve aircraft in the depot are to replace or repair combat losses, not sustain a force indefinitely. The northern deployment of the RAAF gives us one shot. However, the concept is moot now that the Chinese have the capacity to maintain a force off the Australian coast under what is now described as grey zone warfare. The Chinese preferred method would be maintaining a threatening posture, either by ships alone or also using long-range aircraft. This is exactly what we're seeing the Americans and British do in the Gulf and Eastern Mediterranean, and it creates a very difficult long-term defensive posture for minor powers in the region to maintain. For Australia, it means potential combat at a time and in a method of China's choosing. Now this brings us back to the cruise and why it was so much of a disaster for the RAAF. The Chinese Navy just showed us it has the blue water muscle to threaten Australia with 2 task forces, one to the northwest and now to the southeast. These 2 naval task forces are separated by over 5,000 kilometres. This distance is such that the ADF is faced with 2 distinct areas of operations and with very limited ability to swap assets between the 2, and that doesn't matter whether they are land, sea or air. Combined with the Royal Australian Navy putting surface ships in harm's way to the northwest of Australia, the situation quickly becomes critical if the number of patrolling aircraft increases to 6. While it doesn't sound like a lot, especially for defending a continent, the impact is catastrophic. The figures for maintaining just 6 aircraft in the air now change to the following. In simple terms, what these figures mean is that the fragility of the F-35 will result in the collapse of the RAAF's reserves as a result of any intensive but relatively short threat posture by the Chinese. If you need to include the movement of aircraft back from a bare base, depending upon the mode, you can add anywhere from 2 hours to 2 days to the time taken to repair a critical failure. What all these numbers come down to is that the RAAF can probably maintain itself for some time if the threat is contained to the northwest, but in the face of multiple threats it will soon collapse unless hard choices are made. And these choices include abandoning any sustained air defence of the southeast or even that of a naval task force. And that means the Royal Australian Navy would have to abandon a permanent presence in the northwest other than whatever aged Collins-class submarines are available. Hugh White's book, How to Defend Australia, is a philosophical basis for the DSR. The availability problems is one of the reasons Hugh White recommended doubling the size of the RAAF's fighters, though I think even he'd be surprised by the results for the F-35. The RAAF simply lacks depth, or mass as I prefer to call it, and this leg of the Chinese cruise proved that it is incapable of operating simultaneously on two sides of the continent. This means the question of whether the F-35s were a good fit for Australia has to be asked. I will state quite firmly that Australia definitely should have purchased the F-35. The problem is that, like most of our defence acquisitions, we went purely for the exquisite, despite whether or not they are the best fit for any potential threat other than the one the ADF leadership wants us to face. Again, I am not disputing that the F-35 is currently one of the finest fighter aircraft in the world, but rather whether it will do what we need. Its capabilities are far beyond that required to defeat a cruise missile raid against targets in the southeast. In the Ukraine, venerable F-16s have proven to be excellent interceptors, while in Central Africa, the French Rafale has reportedly achieved extended availability rates of up to 90% while conducting operations in extremely harsh conditions. It also has a combat range, without in-flight refueling, 50% greater than that of the F-35. Would the Rafale survive against a fifth-generation fighter? No, but it is more than enough for protecting the demographic heartland in the southeast from cruise missiles, and its better availability rate means that we would need far fewer and at a fraction of the cost of an F-35. Equally, the maintenance facilities and supply chain for all these aircraft are much more diverse and robust, and therefore cheaper, than that of the F-35. This now leads me to the fatal flaw. Throughout modern military history, there have been many spectacular successes or failures, depending upon your viewpoint. Almost exclusively, they are the result of superior strategic planning in the lead-up, or else better application of an aggressor's military capabilities. Even countries with significant flaws, such as Japan's vulnerability to a submarine offensive, still took time and mass for the Americans to exploit. Outside of the Napoleonic campaign from Leipzig to April 1814, I'm struggling to think of examples in military history for a country to have a single feature that creates an absolute. It is a flaw so profound that an aggressor could apply minimal force and render a country's defence planning to a useless pile of paper. In 1814, it was, of course, Napoleon himself. Should he have fallen, the war would have ended almost immediately. Bizarrely, in 2025, the Chinese cruise has shown that somehow Australia has managed to achieve it. That fatal flaw is the Williamtown depot. It is the softest of soft targets, simply because the DSR did not allow for any type of long-range strike against this facility. It's not just how vulnerable the cruise proved it to be, it's because the fragility of the F-35 is so profound and its maintenance requirements so complex that the destruction of this depot would see the RAAF dwindle into irrelevance almost immediately. This means that so too does the DSR collapse. Consider this scenario. In a period of heightened tension, a Chinese submarine operating anywhere within a 2,000 kilometre arc off the east coast of Australia launches multiple cruise missiles to attack not specifically the airfield at RAAF Williamtown, but the maintenance depot for the F-35s. Again, I will emphasise that this type of attack in the Middle East is so common now that it often doesn't even make it as a lead story on the nightly news. The weakness created by the fragility of the F-35 and its logistics system does not, by itself, invalidate the DSR and the pivot to the north. Instead, the logic behind the implementation of the DSR collapses once a Chinese cruise went down the east coast. This is because the DSR is only designed for a single threat scenario. There are things we can do to address the problems with the F-35. We could adopt the United States Navy and Israeli maintenance choice of service personnel rather than contractors. The RAAF could, actually should, convert one F-35 squadron to another aircraft. This would effectively almost double the number of reserve aircraft and the average number of flying hours per F-35. This should offset some of the effects of ageing. We could duplicate the Williamtown depot at one of the BEAR bases. This would cost a tremendous amount. However, there is no point doing so until the glacial upgrade pace for the BEAR bases is resolved, and there is no point creating a second depot that is a softer target as Williamtown. The cost keeps growing. However, if we do duplicate the depot in the north, the real question is where do we invest the billions of dollars required? The Chinese have shown their ability to project a significant threat simultaneously on both sides of the continent. Or, if you like, they can also do it simultaneously across the entire top end. We can't afford to create a depot at all BEAR bases, but if we are going to stick with the DSR, we need to pick one and hope for the best. Now, due to the length of this presentation, and probably to your great relief, I'm going to break it up here. In part 3, I'm going to look at what the cruise showed about the Royal Australian Navy, the serious questions of leadership it raised, and the implied threats made by the cruise which highlighted additional military risks Australia must mitigate. Thanks for your patience. I know I do go on, but I find it all very, very interesting. So until part 3, have a good time.